Hello, welcome to Halcyon Blink. My name's Lon Rise and I'm going to be your host for this episode. And on this edition, let's talk about a show that many of my viewers may not have heard of. It's called Louder with Crowder. Well, what is Louder with Crowder? Stephen Crowder is a comedian slash Republican activist in America who hosts a podcast slash visual radio show style YouTube show, but also has a website and broadcasts it elsewhere. But YouTube, he predominantly doesn't upload the entirety of his shows. I think it's more excerpts that he uploads. Why do I think it's notable to talk about him? Well, I mentioned him on a previous podcast, and yeah, I didn't go into a tremendous amount of detail beyond the fact that I feel that he can come across as very endearing at first, but then he has subtle undertones and motivations that maybe escape people at first.
Special times!
Special times!
It's all about
A few moments later.
Although you didn't strangle the tranny who grabbed you on that show.
Well,
I would have paid good money for you to just go back and go, huh? I can do the Vulcan death grab as well, and just see and just let the cards fall where they may.
Well, also,
and it's important to keep your eyes open for these sorts of things. However, I want to talk about what's good and bad about the show. What's good about the show? It's hard not to be entertained by him at sometimes. He'll do skits, he'll do voiceovers, he'll do jokes, he'll do all of this other stuff, and hides behind effectively the same motivation that Jon Stewart used to have, which is, I'm a comedian first. I'm here to entertain people. I'm here to give them a perspective that I have built for myself and I've honed and I've crafted. This is my take. This is just what I'm telling you. I'm not a journalist. I'm not anyone of any moral authority or any moral superiority. This is just what I think. And a lot of the times he does make me chuckle. I can't lie and say that some of the jokes that he makes don't hit the mark from time to time, and his mannerisms can be quite funny. His high-pitched persona versus his reasonably goofy look. He kind of looks like Billy on the Street, and Billy on the Street has a very humorous look, I find.
It was just money after all. It's just like a hooker, I assume. So are you the prostitute? How did this work?
What's bad about the show? Well, the hypocrisy for one. So in his Change My Mind segments, where he effectively goes to university campuses and attempts to debate people to get them to change his mind on potentially, pretty, subjects that might cause some controversy, like if he's pro-life, pro-guns, that white privilege is a myth, there are only two genders, things of that nature that he knows that liberal people are likely to argue with him on. But the problem is that he never goes to have his mind changed. He will go armed to the teeth with his perspective in an attempt to undermine their arguments and change their minds. Now, I'm sorry, that doesn't speak to me about having an open mind on a subject. That speaks to me about I've made up my mind and I'm going to go there and prove why my opinion is superior against people. And oftentimes he won't tell them in advance what the debate topic is. I'm going to go prove it against people who haven't had time to prep on the subject, who are likely going to come in as emotive and underprepared in an attempt to emphasize my superiority. And the best example of this is against a kid called Yusuf, on the idea that socialism is evil, where he made several mistakes and Yusuf capitalized and I feel won that particular debate, won that particular argument, even though it was staged to be in Crowder's favor, and utilizing several tactics to attempt to bully him. Leaning in, for instance. I thought that was really, that was not acceptable and not fair. Cutting him off at the knees every time he tried to give a more than one sentence complex answer, saying he's trying to sound clever. All of these things speak to a very narrow-minded individual who is not actually open to having his mind changed or his ideas challenged, because it would then interrupt the message and narrative he's attempting to put across, and it would also mean that he's struggling to maintain the Republican/conservative persona that he knows has brought him the success it has. Being a libertarian or being more liberal or being more democratic in some of his views would hurt his more hardcore audience. So, on balance, would I recommend you watch this show? Yeah, I would, because Despite what people may say, I do feel it's incumbent upon people to try and find a measure of balance between being a conservative and being a liberal. Unless you are. If you really hold an all-conservative viewpoint, fine. If you hold an all-liberal viewpoint, fine. I would argue, though, that both of those standings have some kind of moral deficiency, and as such don't represent what we should all be striving for. We should be, and people say, oh, you're just trying to be morally superior and higher than thou. Well, yeah, that should be the fucking aspiration. If we're all saying, well, we're all flawed and we've just got to deal with it, well, that's not setting the bar anywhere near fucking high enough. And part of that is accepting and understanding the viewpoints of everybody, and that includes this guy. This guy has taken the platform of the podcast/YouTube movement, because he's only 31, he's relatively young when it comes to the media, and applied it to the format that Jon Stewart formulated, i.e. news-based rhetoric that is used to formulate and present ideas for jokes and humorous takes on the wider world in an attempt to make it more digestible for his audience. And he's utilised it very successfully. The problem is that I find some of his viewpoints abhorrent and somewhat obtuse, and there's not really anyone well equipped enough to challenge him on some things. And that's where the show has its ultimate flaw, in that it isn't unbiased and it isn't presenting its facts to you as the audience in the way that it should. It is treating you like a child to a certain extent, but it can be entertaining, and it is worth listening to the opinion, at least to understand the viewpoint of what a lot of conservative Republicans are feeling in terms of the direction that some of the left-leaning activists are taking and how they plan to combat them and make them look infantile and foolish, much in the way that Jon Stewart did for many years on Comedy Central. Ultimately, I criticise a lot of what goes on, and some of its tactics are base, considering the fact, like I say, in that particular debate with Yusuf, for instance, he takes personal insults at some of the things he says, and yet has no qualms with making personal attacks of his own, jibing and being uncivil and being rude and obnoxious when it suits him, because unfortunately, again, he's not an open-minded individual despite what he professes. So, have you seen Steven Crowder's show? Do you have any political allegiances that would mean that you wouldn't give his show a watch? Do you think that perhaps being too liberal or being too conservative can have its benefits, or like I feel, has its detractions from the ultimate goal of peace and serenity and everyone having hugs in the morning? Who knows? I don't know. But as a show, if I'm going to grade it, it's tricky to grade the show. I'd grade it as a 6 out of 10 in terms of its presentation style. It's quite quirky. In terms of his jokes, they're quite funny. But I can't not take into account the fact that I think a lot of what he says is bullshit. So you be the judge on that one. If you do watch his show, or if you watch other things that maybe speak to that kind of genre, what other recommendations do you think people are worth looking into? Do you think it's worth looking into more libertarian or more liberal style podcasts? If so, which ones do you think are worth looking into? Leave your suggestions and comments in the description below. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching this episode of Halcyon Blink. Please like, share, subscribe, check out some of the other content creators in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, and as always, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you guys in the next episode of Halcyon Blink.